Cassin. Great to speak with you today. Would you be able to give us a brief rundown of who you are and where you work at the moment?
I'm a journalist by trade. I've been in the trade nearly 40 years. At the moment, I'm working as a speechwriter for Senator Kim Carr, a Labor senator. I began in journalism in Perth, which was my hometown. Back in 1980, I was a cadet journalist on the West Australian, having previously been a student at the University of Western Australia, where I had my first encounter with the Jesuits. However, my trade, as I said, and I do call it a trade, not a profession, is journalism. I have done various things, been a reporter, feature writer, editor of various sections of several papers that I've worked on, because I later went on to work on The Age and the old Sun News Pictorial, the ancestor of the Herald Sun as it is now. I've been for a long time also a sub-editor. I've worked at the production end of journalism, which is how I came to be recruited to Eureka Street, because Nick Kelly and I used to drink in the same pub. I used to stop off at Norton's in Parkville on my way home from The Age, because we worked a night shift. And the Jesuits from Jesuit Theological College just up the street were usually assembled in the front bar there too. So fortuitously, or some might say providentially, my acquaintance with the Jesuits was renewed in a different way through that. And one day Mick said to me, look, we're thinking of starting a magazine. Would you be interested in coming to work for us?
What did you think then?
I had reached a point in my career, if we can call it that, where I was looking for something a bit different, trying to bring together like my profession, well, trade skills, I will keep calling it a trade, my trade skills, my intellectual interests and my faith. And, you know, this man says, we're thinking of starting a magazine, we'll need someone with your skill. So I thought, yeah, here's the opportunity. And I was hired when they started, and I stayed there until 1995, I think, yeah. 1990, we had the sort of period of preparation beforehand, which involved reinventing some of the other Jesuit publications. But the main job was laying the ground for what became Eureka Street. And then Morag came in as editor and I was the production editor.
What did that preparatory work look like? That just looking at kind of model magazines that you wanted to emulate, sort of thing?
There were some strong disagreements about perhaps how, I'm hesitant to say how secular a magazine it should be,
yes,
but a difference in the style of engagement with the world, and if I could put it that way.
Morag mentioned you. She was saying that I think you're the best headline writer that she's ever worked with. It's also one of the best copy editors. And I think she was saying something like, you can take an article of 1,200 words and shave it down to 800 in no time at all, and it'll read perfectly afterwards.
That is my trade skill, and I think that's what Mick was looking for when he offered me a job over a beer. You know? So
fantastic.
In fact, I mean, Eureka Street was good for me. It gave me a lot of opportunities, both to keep doing that sort of work, which I've always done, but, well, for example, with headline writing, because the magazine format had a bit more flexibility than what I was doing in newspapers, and I was able to indulge myself sometimes. Occasionally came up with headings that people thought were witty, and eventually I managed to win a Walkley Award.
I was about to say, the couple of them won a Walkley, didn't they?
Yeah.
When was that?
Let me see. It just happens to be on the desk. 1994.
So I was just going to say, headline writing, and that's one of the harder elements of kind of any of the work that gets done, I think.
Obviously, at a certain level, you can never distill it into 5 words, but you can write what, to use more recent jargon, would be called a hook. You can put together a thought that might capture a reader for the piece, and hope that by the time they've finished reading it, they won't be too disappointed at having been hooked. So you could, the kind of headline that was required was usually evocative rather than narrowly descriptive. I miss the printed form, seeing it on the shelves. Some might say that's excessively sort of nostalgic of me, but I did like seeing it on newsstands when I walked into a newsagent.
Yeah, I think,
obviously other decisions have been made for the future of the magazine, of which you are now a part, and it's quite remarkable to see that it's been around long enough to have a transition. It's survived.
Exactly, 30 years now. Were you expecting it would have been around for that long?
We certainly hoped that it would, but I don't know that we had any expectations, because we knew what a novel thing it was in Australia, this kind of publication. There had been some forerunners. Many years ago, the Jesuits had a publication called 20th Century, but it was nowhere near as open to different intellectual currents as Eureka Street.
And that openness, is that something that was always going to be part of the plan from Go Point?
Yes.
Like something that...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, dialogue is a bit of a jargon word, but that described what everyone who was involved in the initial conception of the magazine wanted. Margaret Simons, name you might know,
Yes.
she did a series of investigative pieces for the magazine, including, well, they were all very good, but one especially on the Murray-Darling. This was before it was, I mean, everyone talks about the state of Australia's biggest river system now, and they talk about the Murray-Darling plan and as it worked. And Meg wrote about that before it was a public issue. She talked. She wrote this wonderful, very long piece about the irrigation areas on the border of Victoria and South Australia. There was Mark Scully, who's been a friend of mine for many years. He wrote all sorts of pieces for the magazine, from popular culture stuff. He wrote a great entertaining essay about the Phantom of comic strip fame, to he and I went off one Saturday to watch Jeff Fenwick's last fight. And, some people might have questioned whether it was appropriate as a subject, but he wrote about what boxing really involves, both the good and the bad. Eureka Street encompassed writers like that. There was Peter Pearce, who used to be described as Eureka Street's turf correspondent who would write essays from race meetings. And they were stories about the people, the horses, the atmosphere, and the way that fits into Australian culture. I mean, I've picked two examples there that are, I suppose, are very masculine.
Yeah.
But there was many other examples as well from quite different perspectives by different writers. And at the time, Eureka Street brought all of that together in a way that no other publication was doing back in the early 90s. And there was a great flow of ideas out of the magazine too, because other media often picked up stories that Eureka Street published, and then they would go and interview those writers, which was good for us because every time that person got mentioned, it was published in Eureka Street, and it sort of spread that way.
Yeah, and it seems to have been instrumental in the formation of careers and professions, and lots of different writers have appeared even briefly in Eureka Street's pages. Like, I'm surprised that it's
all sorts of people, both experienced writers and people who perhaps didn't know they could write until they tried, ended up in Eureka Street, and they are names that have either were already established but often have since become more established since appearing in Eureka Street.
And I find that amazing. The idea of being able to have some of Australia's best and most talented writers write for Eureka Street. I mean, that seems to be quite an astounding achievement for a magazine that got off the ground. Was that something that you always sort of planned for at the start?
Well, again, it was something we certainly hoped would happen, and in that respect, our hopes were well and truly fulfilled. Yeah, it became a magnet for people.
How did it become a magnet for people? I find that amazing.
Through it being talked about. It started off with a small group of readers who were already part of the Jesuit networks. They introduced it to other people, and it was a kind of process of filtration out into the mainstream. It worked. Morag used to do a weekly radio spot with Ranald McDonald, who was the ABC morning announcer in Melbourne in those days. That got the name of the magazine mentioned. These were all people who had often written for what might be called the little magazines of Australia, but publications like The Anjan. Eureka Street gave them an opportunity to continue to do that sort of writing, but with a slightly broader readership than the other little magazines traditionally had. It gave them an opportunity to write for a slightly broader readership than just the literati, as it were. That was one of the great things about the magazine too, because you had these extremely erudite people, but they didn't just write for an audience of people like themselves. They knew that they were able to write for a broader readership, but without talking down to that readership, and that's a very hard thing to do, to get the right tone, so that it is accessible to sort of ordinary educated readers, but not abstruse or obscure, and certainly not patronising. And it wasn't any of those things.
I think that's really important, and I think that's probably one of the things that I think early Eureka Street seems to have done really well, which was sitting in that Goldilocks zone of being able to discuss ideas in a way that was accessible and appealing for a wider readership.
The magazine had a very keen interest in democracy and ways of making it work better. With all that, it also never tried to hide the fact that it had this Catholic affiliation through the Jesuits. I think Andrew Hamilton put the way that worked very well in something he wrote recently for you, about how those issues that connected faith to the broader culture were not written about in Eureka Street in a way that required a kind of recondite or technical theological language.
I think it's interesting as well. I mean, you mentioned several issues there that are still ongoing today, and I find it, I mean, it's maybe testament to how much the world changes or doesn't change over 30 years, where you pick up an old issue of Eureka Street and you sort of say, oh, we're dealing with a lot of the same stuff.
Yes, and also going back to Meg's pieces again, because she found that she was able to get published at length there, that in a way that she at the time perhaps couldn't in other places. She certainly is published very widely now, but she wrote about Indigenous issues, which were also in the wake of Mabo and Paul Keating's Redfern speech, which were also becoming much more widely debated and discussed in the mainstream. Previously, non-Indigenous Australians have been content to push them aside. So that was, and Frank Brennan, of course, was writing about those issues at the same time as well. And as you say, all of that is still with us.
Yeah.
Not resolved, but I think I don't regard the not resolved bit as an instance of failure. I think what Eureka Street was doing was, on many of these issues, pioneering in building a framework for debate about them that the mainstream industry wasn't doing, not always because it wasn't interested in them, but just didn't have the space or the appropriate forum.
I like that. So Eureka Street's able to then fill a niche that wasn't being addressed by other mainstream publications too.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I'm grateful for having been a part of it, and to all the people I was able to work with, and Morag, and also the Jesuits like Mick Kelly and Bill Uren, for all of that.